Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really complex topic, narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD.
Right, and also those narcissistic traits that maybe don't reach the full diagnostic level but still cause significant issues.
Exactly. We've gathered, well, quite a bit of material for you. We've got articles from various health and psychology sites, think Healthline, Help Guide, Very Well Mind, places like that.
And also medical news today, Talkspace, Bay Area CBT Center, The Well by Northwell, Charlie Health, quite a range.
We also looked at a really interesting case report from a scientific journal, some research via PubMed.
And even some personal stories from a Reddit discussion, which adds a different perspective. Plus a scholarly article on schema therapy.
Yeah. So our mission, really, for you listening, is to go beyond just the surface definitions. We want to unpack some of the maybe surprising facts, different viewpoints.
Look at where NPD might come from, how it actually shows up day to day, and importantly, what can be done about it. Potential pathways for change.
Okay, so let's start unpacking. Where do we begin?
Well, maybe with the basics. What is NPD? At its core, we're talking about a persistent pattern, right? It's not just a mood.
Right. A pattern of thinking, behaving, mostly centered around this like inflated sense of self-importance.
Exactly. That plus a really deep need for admiration from others, often excessive admiration, and critically, a real lack of empathy.
Hmm. And sources like Help Guide and the Bay Area CBT Center stress that this isn't just occasional arrogance. It affects everything.
Everything, relationships, work, finances, just general life. It's pervasive.
And a key thing mentioned by Health Guide is the resistance to change, isn't it? People with NPD often don't see the problem in their own behavior.
That's a huge hurdle. They tend to blame others when things go wrong, and they can be incredibly sensitive to criticism. Even constructive feedback can feel like a major attack.
Yeah, that defensiveness must make things really difficult.
It does. Now, something that's really important to grasp is that narcissism isn't monolithic. It's more like a spectrum.
Okay, so not just one type.
No. We often talk about two main presentations. Overt, sometimes called grandiose narcissism.
That's probably the one most people picture, right? The loud, attention-seeking person, very obviously self-important.
That's the stereotype, yes. Bold, wants to be the center of attention, exaggerates achievements. It's all quite well overt.
Okay, and the other end?
That's covert or vulnerable narcissism. And this one can be much harder to spot. The Bay Area CBT Center and the Well by Northwell offer good descriptions here.
So how does that look different?
Well, outwardly, they might seem hypersensitive, maybe even fragile or prone to feeling slighted, but underneath, there's still that hidden sense of superiority.
Ah, okay, so it's more hidden.
Right. And their manipulation could be subtler. Things like gaslighting, maybe passive-aggressive behavior. They often find it hard to form real emotional bonds.
Gaslighting. That's where they make you doubt your own memory or perception.
Exactly. I never said that. Or you're imagining things. It's very confusing for the other person. So yeah, the quiet, maybe even self-pitying person could also fit this pattern. It's not always the loud one.
That's a really key distinction, and it's worth noting, as the Well by Northwell points out, that these terms overt and covert, they aren't official subtypes in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual.
Correct. They're descriptive labels that clinicians and researchers find useful, but the formal diagnosis relies on specific criteria outlined in the DSM-5. Clinicians look for long-term patterns.
Got it. So where does this all come from, the roots of these traits?
The nature versus nurture question, essentially. The research, including that case report we mentioned, points towards a mix. Genetics, maybe some neurobiological factors.
But also environmental factors play a huge role, right? Especially early life experiences.
A very significant role.
Yeah.
The case report specifically highlights adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, as a major risk factor.
ACEs. So we're talking things like abuse, neglect, maybe witnessing violence, growing up with instability.
Precisely. The research summarized in that report found a strong link between experiencing multiple ACEs and developing both vulnerable and grandiose narcissistic traits.
Both. That's interesting.
Yes, although the link seems potentially stronger for the vulnerable type. And perhaps counterintuitively, some sources suggest neglect, the absence of care, might sometimes be even more strongly linked than, say, physical abuse.
Wow, really? Neglect more than overt abuse? Why might that be?
Well, the thinking is complex, but it could relate to the fundamental need for validation and mirroring in childhood. If that's consistently absent, the child might develop maladaptive ways to seek validation or build a fragile defensive self-esteem.
Okay. And the report also talked about dysfunctional household environments generally, like poverty, conflict, parental mental health issues.
Yes, those factors can compound the risk. They create an environment where maybe maladaptive coping strategies are learned or even necessary for survival.
And there was that distinction about how parents interact, wasn't there? Something about overvaluation versus neglect.
Right. The idea is that excessive parental praise and overvaluation, you're perfect, you're special, might contribute more to the grandiose type.
Inflating the ego from the start.
Kind of. Whereas childhood neglect or abuse might be more associated with the vulnerable type, leading to that underlying fragility and hypersensitivity beneath a potentially defensive exterior.
It helps to see it laid out like that. The case study you mentioned really brought some of this to life, didn't it?
It really did. It focused on a 75-year-old retired Vietnamese man. His daughter noticed his narcissistic traits seemed to be worsening with age.
What kinds of things did she observe?
A lot of lecturing, belittling others, being financially dependent but acting superior, becoming socially isolated, and quite extreme grandiosity.
Like the example where he claimed his wisdom exceeded the Buddha's.
Exactly that. Pretty striking, isn't it?
Definitely. And his background was relevant, too.
Very much so. He came from a wealthy family in Saigon. His father was described as a workaholic, and his mother apparently instilled this idea that the family was special, maybe uniquely insightful.
Okay, so maybe some early overvaluation there.
Possibly. But then came a major adverse childhood experience. At age 10, during the war, he was sent away to live with an uncle described as unloving, while the rest of his family fled.
That must have been incredibly disruptive and frightening.
He reported feeling like a stranger when he finally returned 5 years later. That separation and lack of warmth is a significant ACE.
And how did things unfold later in his life?
Well, there were more hardships. Reluctance to flee Vietnam initially, time in a refugee camp, struggles with depression after moving to the U.S. But then he achieved significant business success back in Vietnam.
The jewelry business, where he said he lived like a king.
That's the one. And in the interview for the case report, the grandiosity was very apparent. He described himself as high class, a gifted singer, claimed to receive divine messages.
And showed a real disregard for other people's feelings.
A classic trait. Now, the report notes he presented mainly with grandiose features, but they didn't have formal psych testing, which is a limitation. But his history, the potential mix of early overvaluation combined with significant adversity, especially that prolonged separation and lack of warmth, it provides a compelling real-life illustration of how these factors might interact.
It really does. It shows how deep those roots can go. Okay, so let's shift focus a bit. How do these traits impact relationships? We hear the term narcissistic abuse a lot.
Yes, and it's a vital area. Narcissistic abuse, as outlined in several sources we looked at, is essentially a form of emotional and psychological abuse.
And the goal is primarily about control.
Exactly. Maintaining power and control over the other person. It involves behaviors like emotional manipulation, gaslighting, constant lying, that profound lack of empathy we mentioned, and trampling over personal boundaries.
And there's often a pattern, especially in romantic relationships, something about a cycle.
Yes, the cycle of abuse is frequently described. It often starts with love bombing.
Love bombing, like overwhelming affection at the beginning.
Precisely. Intense, rapid attention, gifts, declarations of love. It feels amazing, but it's often designed to hook the person quickly.
And
Then comes the devaluation phase. The compliments turn to criticism, the affection cools, the person is chipped away at, belittled.
That sounds awful.
It is. And eventually, this can lead to the discard phase, where the narcissist might abruptly end the relationship, often cruelly, leaving the other person completely bewildered and devastated.
That cycle sounds terrifyingly effective. We saw some really raw examples of the impact of this in that Reddit discussion, didn't we? The one asking about subtle signs people missed.
Oh, absolutely. Those personal accounts were incredibly powerful. They really highlighted the insidious nature of it, especially with the covert type.
People talked about feeling this constant low-level confusion, doubting themselves, feeling anxious but not quite knowing why.
Exactly. Signs like the partner subtly undermining their friendships. Oh, are your friends really genuine? Stuff like that.
Or conversations always staying surface level, never getting deep, even after years together.
Yeah, or the constant blaming of others. Nothing is ever their fault. And the difficulty, or outright refusal, to apologize sincerely.
And the gaslighting examples were stark. Denying things said, twisting events.
Making the victim feel like they are the crazy one. Another common theme was the partner being treated like an extension of the narcissist,
Meaning,
meaning if the partner had different opinions or needs or just wanted to do their own thing, the narcissist would get angry or withdraw affection, like the partner wasn't allowed to be a separate person.
wow. Other things mentioned were, let's see, casually dismissing the partner's day or concerns, calling them negative if they voiced unhappiness.
Being emotionally unavailable but making huge demands on the partner's time and energy.
Right. And that thing about behaving inappropriately with others, maybe flirting, to make the partner feel insecure.
Yes, to make the partner feel lucky to have them, despite the bad treatment. It's a way of controlling through insecurity.
It's so manipulative, also twisting conversations around so they always end up the victim.
The classic victim stance, and criticizing the partner's friends and family to isolate them.
And just a fundamental lack of empathy, even when the partner was clearly distressed.
That came up again and again. Plus, future faking, making big promises about the future together that never materialize.
And disrespecting boundaries, just ignoring requests or limits.
It all paints a picture of targeted manipulation and dishonesty. As one source put it, victims can start to question their own reality. And this isn't just in romantic relationships. It happens with family, friends, colleagues, too.
It sounds incredibly damaging. Which brings us back to the big question, can this change? Can someone with NPD actually change these deeply ingrained patterns?
Well, it's challenging. As Help Guide noted, there's often significant resistance. Many individuals with NPD don't believe they need to change.
But it's not impossible. Some sources like BetterHelp and Talkspace seemed more optimistic about therapy.
Yes, therapy can help. The goal isn't usually a complete personality overhaul. Maybe that's unrealistic. It's more about increasing self-awareness.
Helping them see the patterns and their impact.
Exactly. And learning better ways to manage emotions, impulses, and interact with others. Developing healthier coping strategies.
Okay. And there are different therapeutic approaches, right? Talkspace mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Right. CBT is quite common. It focuses directly on identifying and challenging those unhelpful thought patterns and the behaviors that stem from them.
Like, okay, when X happens, I tend to think Y, which makes me do Z. Let's try to change Y.
Sort of, yes.
Huh.
It's often shorter term, maybe 5 to 20 sessions, and can be effective for specific issues. There's even online CBT available.
But for deeper personality patterns, maybe other therapies are needed. You mentioned schema therapy earlier.
Yes, the article on schema therapy was fascinating. It digs deeper into those early maladaptive schemas, those core negative beliefs formed in childhood.
Beliefs about oneself, about relationships.
Exactly. And it looks at the coping modes people develop. For NPD, common modes might be the self-aggrandizer, puffing oneself up, or the detached self-soother, maybe using substances or distractions to avoid difficult feelings.
And there's often a strong inner critic, the demanding parent mode, and a hidden, vulnerable child feeling lonely or flawed underneath.
That's the model, yes. Schema therapy aims to strengthen the healthy adult mode, the rational, balanced part of the self.
How does it do that?
Through techniques like limited reparenting, where the therapist provides some of the validation and empathy that might have been missing early on, within clear boundaries, of course.
A corrective emotional experience almost?
Kind of. And also empathic confrontation, gently but directly challenging the narcissistic patterns while still showing understanding for where they might have come from.
That sounds complex, but potentially powerful. What other therapies were mentioned?
Talkspace listed several. Transference-focused psychotherapy, which looks at how past relationship dynamics play out in current ones, especially with the therapist.
So using the therapy relationship itself as a tool.
In a way, yes. Then there's mentalization-based therapy, MBT. That helps people understand their own and others' mental states, better thoughts, feelings, intentions.
Improving that empathy deficit, perhaps.
That's a key goal. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, is another one. It's great for emotional regulation, tolerating distress, and improving relationship skills.
Skills that are often lacking.
Right. And EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, was mentioned too.
Isn't that usually for trauma?
It is, but given the potential link between ACEs and NPD, it might be used to process underlying traumatic memories that could be contributing to the narcissistic defenses. It uses things like eye movements to help process those memories.
Interesting. And finally, metacognitive interpersonal therapy, MIT.
Yeah, another approach focused on deconstructing those maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors within relationships.
So quite a few options, but it sounds like finding the right therapist is key.
Absolutely critical. Someone experienced specifically with NPD or narcissistic traits is essential. And it's important to remember, as BetterHelp noted, there are no pills to cure NPD.
Right, no medication for the personality disorder itself.
No, but medication might be used to treat co-occurring conditions like depression or anxiety, which are common.
Okay. Now, what about the people on the receiving end, the victims of narcissistic abuse? What helps them heal?
That's equally important. The sources consistently emphasize validation. Just having someone believe their experience and acknowledge the reality of the abuse is huge.
Because they've often been gaslit and made to doubt themselves.
Exactly. Support is crucial. Support groups with others who understand, or therapy with a professional knowledgeable about narcissistic abuse dynamics.
And setting boundaries.
Absolutely vital. Learning to set and enforce firm boundaries is key to regaining a sense of self and safety, and prioritizing self-care, rebuilding self-esteem, and focusing on their own needs.
Makes sense. There was also mention of a specific therapy for children and teens who've experienced trauma, TFCBT.
Yes, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It's designed for young survivors, and importantly, it usually involves the non-abusive caregiver.
And it has specific components, the PRACTICE acronym.
Right. It covers psychoeducation, relaxation skills, affect regulation, cognitive coping, writing a trauma narrative, in vivo exposure, gradually facing trauma reminders safely, conjoint parent-child sessions, and enhancing safety. It's quite structured.
So wrapping this all up, it seems NPD is complex, exists on a spectrum, often has roots in early adversity.
And can cause significant harm in relationships through abusive patterns, but change is possible with the right therapy, though it's challenging.
And healing is definitely possible for those who've been impacted. There are pathways to recovery and support available.
Absolutely. Which leads us to a final thought, perhaps, for you listening, considering how widespread narcissistic traits and their impact can be.
What does this mean for us as a society? How does it affect things like empathy, the way we communicate, how we understand mental health overall?
Yeah, and what role can just being more aware, understanding these dynamics, better play in maybe fostering healthier relationships or creating better support systems?
Definitely something to think about. We encourage you to look more into the resources if this resonated, and please seek professional help if you recognize these experiences in your own life or relationships.